Therapists, we have chosen a rewarding but very challenging profession. And it is not uncommon at all for therapists to, over the course of their career, deal with episodes of burnout that can be pretty severe, not just impacting our work, but our mental and emotional health, our wellness, and even impact our relationships outside of the practice space that we're in. So that's why I couldn't be happier on today's episode of Love, Happiness, and Success for Therapists to talk to our colleague, Dr. Jen Blanchette. She's a psychologist who actually specializes in helping therapists like us navigate professional burnout. So welcome, Dr. Jen.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm so glad that we were able to do this together because this is just such a pain point for many therapists. And I know that I have experienced this myself at moments throughout my career in various chapters. And, in my role, I'm managing a group practice, I'm a clinical supervisor. And even in a fairly sheltered environment like Growing Self, I still regularly deal with therapists who get kind of crispy, if you know what I'm talking about. And it just takes such a toll. And so we have so much to talk about today. But to begin with, you were a therapist in private practice. And then it sounds like you had some of your own life experiences that led you to pivot. And I'm wondering if you would be open to just sharing your story with our listeners. Is that okay?
Yeah, of
Yay.
course. My story is something I share quite regularly on my podcast. I think I just want to go back to my training a little bit.
Mhm.
So I did my dissertation actually on compassion fatigue. So
Okay.
it's been an interest of mine, I think, throughout my career. I think like my first experience of burnout really came as a caseworker. So
Mhm.
before I even became a psychologist, I struggled as a caseworker and then went into a doctoral program. I did a dissertation on compassion fatigue and foster
Mm.
parents.
Wow.
And I was really gravitating towards those trainings for compassion fatigue and burnout. And by the way, it's like tumbleweeds in there to therapist.
It's what?
All the burnout trainings, it's like tumbleweeds. Like no one is in the burnout training.
Really?
Everyone wants to do like the skill based training or
Interesting.
some kind of neat other training. So it's like, why
Mhm.
aren't all such therapists? Why aren't they at the burnout training? I digress. I've been interested for a long time. And I feel, I've kind of brushed up like little bouts of burnout, one big one as a caseworker. And then something happened in 2020. I'm not sure what exactly it was, but
Let me see if I can remember what happened in 2020. I was like,
right. So I think I started a private practice. And the reason why I started the private practice was really because of I could not work in an agency job because I had a baby who had a heart surgery. And
oh,
coming
wow.
back, yeah, so he's 11, he's good. So doing
Mhm.
well now. But at the time, I was supposed to go back full time and they would not take me back part time. And I couldn't leave him.
Of
And
course.
this had me launch a private practice when I was a new mother to a baby who went through heart surgery and having to navigate all that. But I did it. And so part of me is like really proud of that
Mhm.
psychologist who I was,
Mhm.
figured out like making a website on WordPress like back in 2013, which was not as easy as it is now, by the
Nope.
way. And I did it. I launched the thing and it was good for a while. I mean, I think I was chugging along. I had this baby and I also taught for a little bit. And then 2020 hit and I was in a state of fight or flight. Most of us were as
Mm.
therapists, I think, for probably the next solid 2 to 3 years. And it really just felt like I had to keep going. I felt like I had all these clients. It was just me in the office. And I felt trapped,
Mhm.
honestly. I felt like I created this thing and now I felt trapped by it.
Mhm.
And I started this unraveling of what does this mean? So I remember in 2021 having this kind of hot crying tear moment in my own therapy session where I told my therapist, I don't think I want to be a therapist anymore.
Mhm.
And I was like, even as I said it, I was like, did I just say that? Is this happening? And I think the actions that I did after that was trying to figure it all out. So it's like, maybe it's EMDR certification. Maybe if I did that and then did a full fee practice, maybe this could work. maybe it's like offering groups, maybe it's intensives.
Mhm.
So I was trying to do all these things to try to make it work. But really, my realization was I needed a break from therapy. And I didn't let myself do that. I think for lots of reasons, like there was a pandemic, a lot of us were in crisis. And so fast forward 2 more years.
Well, and
Those Yeah,
actually,
go ahead.
if I may ask, would you be willing to say a little bit more, if it is okay to go here?
Of course.
Like, what was it about being a therapist and having that practice that felt really bad for you? Was it something about the interactions with what was happening with clients or the business management side of things? Or I don't know if you were doing like a third party. Can you say a little bit more about what was going on that you were like, I hate this. I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah, all the above. I think it's all the
Hmm.
above. I think now being out of it, what I didn't realize was really the
Hmm.
isolation as a solo practitioner was huge.
Yeah.
In our training, I remember as a psychologist, I think there was a time where I had 5 hours of supervision. And I was like, how could anyone get burnout? It's you're talking about therapy all the time. It's so great. And then you go to having nothing, like you
Right.
having really no peer support.
Hmm.
And unless you seek that out, it doesn't happen in private practice. So I think
Absolutely.
it was the social isolation, which was compounded more in COVID because we were all socially isolated, right? I had
Mm.
young children, had no childcare. So I had a kindergartner and a preschooler at the time.
Ugh.
So again, it's like caring never stopped. I was
Yeah.
at work, I'm caring for clients. I was at home, I'm caring for my children. And I think that whole like caring continuum, which I talk to my therapist clients about a
Hmm.
lot, is we have a quotient of caring. And when it's done, it's done.
Yeah.
So I,
And you
for
didn't have
me,
anybody taking care of you. Do you know what I mean? Like you had all this energy going out in different places and didn't feel like you were part of this support system that was helping to support you and fill you back up too. Which no, I just want to say that because I think that is the reality for many, if not most therapists. I mean, when we go through school, we have these beautiful little cohorts and then we're in
yeah,
supervision and then it's boom, you get pushed off a cliff. People like, good luck with that. I mean, you're totally on your own a lot of the time. I just wanted to validate that because it's so real.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think it was the isolation, the practice management I actually got help with, I think
Mhm.
in COVID, because I think all of that caring, I was like, I can't do my own billing and everything anymore. So
Yeah.
finally, after like 6 years in practice, I got help. And I
Mhm.
think I always recommend therapists like, don't do your own admin stuff if you
Mhm.
can do it. I understand you like costs are hard in the beginning and startup. So I always recommend to try to get some admin support. So it wasn't so much all of that. I think it was more the isolation. And then I
Mhm.
was an EMDR therapist. I still hold that certification as an EMDR
Mhm.
therapist, actually. And so it was also the trauma work. It was
Yeah.
the vicarious trauma pieces that I think
Mm.
stacked my career, not maybe
Mhm.
just some of what I was experiencing clinically with, but it was. Now that I think about it, there
Mhm.
were a few clients because at the time I specialized as a Christian psychologist. And I haven't talked about this a lot on my podcast, but I think part of what was happening politically and socially for
Mhm.
me to identify that way was that clients had assumptions about who I was and what I believed. And
I
I think interestingly enough, faith got tied to politics
Mhm.
in 2020 in ways I could not have foreseen.
Yeah.
And then clients were thinking I was aligned with their values. And for me, I feel like that was partly like that moral injury piece of feeling like, number one, I'm reckoning with my own faith in this process with clients because they're
Mhm.
making these assumptions of me and their own faith belief. So I think
Yeah.
that was a part of it, which I
Mhm.
think is outgrowth. Some people call that vicarious traumatization, where you have the spiritual implications that happen from trauma work.
Mhm.
Also, I feel like some people talk about the moral injury from insurance dictating care and those types of things, which also were huge.
Mm.
And so that was there. And also, I lost two clients in COVID. So, two clients, loved clients that I had.
Mm. I'm so
And
sorry. That's the worst thing that can happen to us.
yeah. And so the clinical grief, I think I thought about it a lot. One of those clients passed in April of 2020, very suddenly. It was cancer.
Mhm.
And for that client especially, I identified a lot with her as a maternal figure. So
Mhm.
then which is so weird in therapy that our clients can have those kind of relationships and that countertransference happens for us. And it was like she was such this grounding presence in my
Mhm.
caseload too,
Yeah.
that I would look forward to every week. And then I think without her there, it was really hard for me.
Mhm.
And then that fall in 2020, I lost another client. I got another medical, like I knew it was coming
Mhm.
possibly,
Mhm.
but I didn't know it was going to come in the way it did.
Yeah.
So I know we're not supposed to Google clients, but I had no idea where this client was. And I knew they had surgery and I Googled them and found their obituary. And so then there's another
Ugh.
layer of I have
Right.
this closeness with this client and this is how I find out about their death. And so I think for me, it was a big part of that clinical grief, the isolation, a lot of things that were happening. Yeah. So I'll let you jump in and
Well, no, that's
thoughts.
a lot though, because it's layer after layer, and I'm so sad for everything that you've gone through. And I think that I'm so glad that we're talking about this because this
Yeah.
is what many therapists experience, and being in contact with a lot of intrinsically traumatizing content just by virtue of particularly specializing in EMDR, and then these losses, and then the stress of managing a life on top of all of this, and all of the
Yeah.
caretaking, and doing it all in isolation. And I think it's just it needs to be respected, and I hope that therapists who are resonating with us are just feeling a little bit seen, because I think one of the things that can be so hard is some of the narrative around, "I was a better therapist," or "If I were more competent," or "What's wrong with me that I'm being impacted in the way that I am?" And
Yeah.
it turns into a lot of self-blame, and it's yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it's so interesting how it's just what human brains do. We tend to personalize. So when something tragic happens, I know this is part of my trauma response is I think of
Mhm.
what did I do wrong? Like when I lost those two clients, did I do enough? Did I tell them I cared
Right.
enough? And I know that's what happens to me in grief anyway. That's just my
Mhm.
grief response. And I just have to
Sure.
ground myself and tell myself, this is grief.
Yeah.
This is how you experience grief. And
Mhm.
I think for
Yeah.
therapists, when I hear them talking to me about the grief part, especially for clinicians who have lost a client by suicide, I have some clients who write into me and some that I work with to help them navigate this clinical grief piece is that there's nothing that you did that was wrong. This is part of the work, unfortunately. This is the tragic part of the work
Yeah.
that we often don't give voice to.
So right. And you know what else too is even coming up for me hearing this? Is like that therapists experience these kinds of losses, and there's a very real clinical grief, but at the same time, because of the boundaries around these professional roles, we are shut out of the rituals of grief, and the connections that we would have in personal relationships, right? You
Yeah.
would go to the funeral. I bet your client's family didn't even know you existed, probably, if there were the professional boundaries, right? Wouldn't think to call you. It's like you're this shadow that nobody even knows is there. And so any loss is terrible, but I think the human response is to how do we bond with other people who knew and loved this person and as therapists? We can't do any of that.
Yeah.
And so there's that piece of it as well. And that's just a really interesting facet to consider, but I can
Mhm.
understand how this coma in a burnout. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And I
yeah.
think as I've talked about it now, I've been podcasting on burnout for a year and a
Mhm.
half. So I think therapists most readily call it burnout, but I
Yeah.
think it is these other pieces. It's the
Mm.
vicarious traumatization, it's compassion fatigue, it's that constant giving and caring that I felt early in the pandemic that was a struggle for me. And I think it's also like this moral injury piece of sometimes I've been wounded by the systems I'm in, whether
Yeah.
that be if a therapist is an agency and they're asked to do things that aren't appropriate, insurance doesn't pay, and then
Mhm.
they feel like tension of should I go private pay because this isn't working for me? I don't want to be in this system.
Right.
For me, that came more with the system of foster care. So
Mm.
having to remove a child from a home and
Yeah.
witnessing the trauma I'm actually part of for that
Right.
child. I think it is these pieces, we most readily call it burnout as therapists, but there are layers that I think that we don't really examine and talk about as often because they're really tricky, and I think there's a lot of inherent shame that therapists have if they're struggling, like, with clinical grief, and they don't know how. yeah, I didn't have that ritual of going to a memorial service. What do I even do with this? How do I can't even tell my family or my friends about my client because of confidentiality.
Right.
So I think Pauline Boss gives us a nice model, the ambiguous loss model, to understand like what we do with losses that are ambiguous, that are unclear.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think starting to have more of these conversations is important for therapists
Mhm.
and to understand there's a lot of us are experiencing these things and not your own failing, which a lot of therapists get to feeling, unfortunately, is what I sit when I sit with them. It's like, "Well, I'm doing my breathing and I'm trying to work out." I'm like, that's we can do all of that we want. That's stress management. So a lot of burnout prevention is stress
Mhm.
management. That is a
Mm.
lot of what we're given. And so, of course, it's going to set us up if we have done our meditation and our breathing and our yoga and our walks, if we're still burnout, quote unquote. Yeah,
Yeah.
because that was stress management. And maybe you need burnout recovery now because you're past the point where stress management can be helpful with those things.
Of course. Yeah, because what you're talking about is really like taking big hits, right?
Yeah.
that feel damaging and that there's no opportunity to recover. There is not really a healing process. It's like just over and over again. And again, I'm so happy that we're talking about this because you're highlighting something that's very important, which is that burnout, air quote burnout, it is a multi-dimensional experience and that there is a reason why it happens that in our field is often related to a number of very painful, difficult, real things and the experience of moral injury and to do things that don't fit for you. And I don't know if this is even part of your experience, but like just thinking back about therapists that I have known or my own experiences that I think for others there can be, I think, burnout that comes from this persistent existence in this very ambiguous space that is incredibly anxiety provoking when
Yeah.
you are the one that people are looking to for help and support and their marriage is on the line and they're coming to you and maybe you don't know exactly how to help them because that's the thing about our field, right? This is not a
Yeah.
black and white thing. There are so many different ways of helping. And I think existing in that state of ambiguity that we're never really sure exactly what the right thing is to say or the right intervention. And, thinking about our sessions after the fact, did I do that right? And also clients becoming upset with us if they're not getting the outcomes that they want from their work with us that may
Yeah.
or may not actually be related to what we are saying or not saying. Like they're also participants in this work. And it is just incredibly stressful on so many levels. Yeah. So take us more into the experience of burnout. I think that in recent years, there have been more efforts to define burnout as a thing. Like they're hearing about it in organizational literature and it's on people's radars. But I would love to hear you talk about how you would identify or assess burnout for therapists in particular. If this is starting to happen in someone, what does it look like? Is there
Yeah.
feelings, thoughts, behaviors that go along with this that can give us all visibility into whether or not we are on that particular water slide?
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of physical symptoms
Hmm.
is how it starts for a lot of people. And also like feelings when you start to feel that creep up of resentment.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us talk about anger as, as a surface emotion, but it's
Mhm.
also, it gives us a lot of information when we're starting
Yeah,
to get more salty in our sessions.
for
And
sure.
we have reduced ability to take perspective. So I think
Hmm.
that's for therapists, that's what I notice is one of the key and it's also part of burnout. Like we start to become across the board, just for the definition, is become resentful
Hmm.
of the situation we're asked to do. And we have
Right.
reduced personal efficacy. So we feel like we're less effective in our job.
Hmm.
And I definitely that resonated for me early, not early. Well, I don't think that was a problem for me as a therapist. Like I often felt very competent. Like
Hmm.
I know my stuff.
Yeah.
I feel like I had good training. And so it wasn't something I struggled with until I really hit some burnout to feel like, I don't even know what I'm doing. I really have less investment in what I'm doing in the
Mhm.
therapy work. I cared about my clients, of course, but I think those situations, those clients that were harder for me to navigate,
Mm.
I just really felt ineffective. And so I
Mhm.
think that that's one of the hallmarks, feeling more distant from the work again. And then starting to have the physical symptoms
Mm.
of feeling exhausted,
Yeah.
constantly tired, feeling like a therapist tell me this all the time. I reduce my schedule and I'm
Mm.
still tired. That is hallmark burnout, especially for therapists when they say,
Mhm.
when they start to feel it and they're like, I know I need to reduce my schedule. I've done a lot of that now, but I'm still tired. I'm only seeing 4 clients a day. Why am I so tired? And so I think that's for a couple of reasons, right? I think our cup as we get older, we have older in, it becomes like we have to care for them. So we have caring going out over here. And so
Mhm.
being able be able to give more clinically isn't as possible as it was before. So that's
Mhm.
one thing. For me, I actually developed mental health symptoms. So I experienced depression and panic attacks as an
Mm.
outgrowth of my burnout.
Right.
So I suddenly started having panic attacks while
Mm.
driving. And my
That's
body and my nervous system really gave me information to say, you need to change what you're doing.
yeah.
And so that was more the wake up call. And around that time where I said, I don't think I can be a therapist anymore. And I think my body was really, that happens to me anyway. My body will give me indications before my mind will catch up with it. And so I had to do about a year and a half of my own EMDR therapy to work through the things I need to work through to get through
Mhm.
the driving stuff. Also, this coincided for me, and I want to bring this up because it's so important for women
Yeah.
in midlife. I went through sudden menopause at 38. So I,
Really?
had
Yeah.
I'm in medical menopause as of 38 due to
Mhm.
have ovaries, due to some health things.
Mhm.
I developed sudden depression from that over the years that I never had before, and anxiety.
Mhm.
And that was compounded by the burnout and by all the stress I was experiencing through all that, through the year of 2020, really. And I
Mm.
just think it's important because a lot of women therapists going through this in midlife are also
Mhm.
struggling through menopause. And I just
Abs
want to keep it on your radar.
Oh, it's on the radar, Dr. Jen. Oh, yeah.
Could also be dealing with like hormonal shifts.
Yeah.
And I think even throughout my practice, I was dealing with the whole time with hormonal shifts, right? Because
Mhm.
how I was having babies. I had 2 babies
Yeah.
during the time of my practice. And then all the hormonal changes that happen after you have a child. And
Mm.
then for me, sudden menopause, dealing with that and navigating through hormone replacement therapy, which no one knows about. I went on a 5-year journey to figure out the right medications for myself. And so I was on no medication after not having ovaries, which is, I tell this
That must
because
have been brutal.
we need more education for women, I think, around just menopause and how to manage that because
Yeah.
there's mental health implications. And I personally have lived experience of that. Something I'm also passionate about.
Yeah.
Just keep that on the radar.
Yeah.
So anyway, I know I was talking about symptoms of burnout and delved into the
Well,
sidebar
no,
here on
but it's
menopause.
yeah, but no, but it's so important, and I think one of my big takeaways and things that I absolutely also relate to in the story is that it can probably manifest a little bit differently for all of us. As you were talking, like when I was thinking about my worst chapters of burnout, was definitely that exhaustion and that like much lower empathy than usual and just not caring, but just like feeling checked out a little bit, but
Yeah.
also avoidant behaviors, not following through with some things or spending way too much time scrolling through celebrity gossip. And I couldn't watch anything intense on TV. My husband, he's very into these shows with dystopian hellscapes and science. And I was like, I want maybe a rom-com, but only if it's not
Yeah,
stressful, that
I'm for
kind of thing.
Bridgerton now. Miss Bridgerton,
Yeah,
thank you.
exactly. There needs singing and ordinarily, like I have no interest in that. So like that is actually one of my burnout symptoms. But then to compound like the realities of our regular life stressors, but what might be going on inside of us internally related to hormones, because I think that we can also be so other focused. I mean, we're naturally
Yeah.
helpers, right? So we're always looking at other people and not checking in on like, how am I doing? And that it is so important, I think, for all of us to get familiar with what are those signs that I'm trending in a not so great direction. And I think it's a professional competency to learn, what does it look like for me when I'm starting to get not okay? Because, well, and I'd love to actually hear your opinions about this. I think, and we may have had different professional experiences in this. I have seen therapists be able to make changes in what they're doing, how they're doing. And sometimes it's environmental, sometimes it is the type of work they're doing or getting into a different environment. Sometimes it needs to be internal changes or doing a better job of respecting their own needs.
Yeah.
But also, there are times when, as you talk about, we get to end stage burnout and you can't really fix that. You need to make a shift. So, I would love to talk a little bit about your thoughts around what you have seen in terms of people, therapists being self-aware and being like, I can't keep doing what I'm doing now. This trajectory is not sustainable, but I can pivot in a positive way in order to remain in this profession, but in a way that feels better for me. Can we talk about that first, if when recovery is possible?
Yeah, I think recovery is possible for anyone. So it's just whether or not can I do therapy? Can I do one-to-one therapy anymore is the question. And
Mm-hmm.
that is just a totally a personal like
Right.
decision. And I think there's some folks that it is just inherent, like they are a therapist. And I talk to them, I work with some
Yeah.
therapists and they want to stay working as therapists. And I'm
Hmm.
like, great. Like I'm not trying to get you to not do therapy because we need therapists. But I think it's so for me, I can just speak. I have a podcast. I've always had 3 jobs. I like working in teams. And
Hmm.
so that's just me personally. Like I've taught, I've done lots of different things. I'd hate to sit down for and then be in a room. It's just not in my personality. Like my body needs to move. I'm a fitness instructor. Yeah, it's just not in my
So, wait,
personality.
sitting in the chair for the 10 hours a day, it was like not compatible with who you are in some basic
Right.
ways.
So
Yeah.
I think it's a lot about like figuring out who you are again. A lot of us, we're figuring, again, I'm going back to midlife, but that's where a lot of this happens for a lot
Yeah.
of folks. Sometimes it is in that early career. If I look back at APA's recent survey on burnout, actually our early career, I think that psychologist from that
Hmm.
research, our early career psychologists and our mid-career psychologists are going to have the most difficulty with burnout. And that makes sense. Like early career, I was struggling too. I was trying to figure it all out. How am I going to do a practice? What am I going to do? All that stuff. So I think if you want to stay, you have to be an expert on rest for yourself. It's like the biggest piece of advice I can give any therapist. How do I get the micro doses of rest every day? So that means like the 10 minutes when you're supposed to be taking a break, you take an actual brain break. So
No, we're doing notes. What are you talking about?
yeah.
No, but yes,
Well,
yes,
AI
you're
AI
right.
can save us. AI can save us from burnout now. That's what all the people are saying.
Oh, great.
Which every time I hear that, I'm just going to be like, I get approached by companies who want to come on my podcast and promote their AI solution for burnout. And I'm like, I am not, I've written them back. I will never say that. It's
Good
not
for
my plan.
you. Oh my gosh, good for you. Yeah, no, that's
Anyways, sidebar. Where was I talking about?
so we were talking about just your thoughts about with my curiosity, can therapists
Yeah.
take this as like a I can't keep doing what I'm doing and pivot? And I think what I'm hearing in this is that it requires a lot of deep soul searching. First of all, do I want to even continue doing therapy at all? And just to validate what you're saying, like I've had quite a few counselors in my practice because, we specialize in coaching and coaching psychology who will say, I do not wish to do any therapy at all, but I would like to do coaching because that it's a different
Right.
model, it's a different vibe, and so that feels okay for them. But needing to explore, are there different ways? I've also worked with therapists who are like, I'm gonna go take a job in HR because I will be able to use some of these skills, but I won't
Right.
have to deal with all of this. And I think that there are a lot of ways that this can look, but that the core of it for you is being able to build in like recovery to the
Yeah.
professional experience.
Yeah. And so I come from neuro rehab as
Yeah.
my training. I trained at a
Mhm.
neuropsychologist. So I often think about what like the pillars of brain health that we need just
Mm.
to function.
Mhm.
So a lot of it we don't apply to ourselves. I was leading into the micro pieces of rest you need every
Mhm.
day, the weekly pieces of rest, and then the big, I don't know if I can cuss on this podcast, but the big
Go ahead.
ass rest that you need, So what does that kind of sabbatical look like? Are you taking
Yeah.
that real, true, deep rest?
Mhm.
We don't get that in a lot of our societies because we're attached to a phone and we're not letting our brains truly rest. So when I worked with people at a neuro rehab, they had to become experts on rest. And I liken this to this process therapists have to do if they're in burnout
Yeah.
because your brain, like they experience actual brain fog. And they're like, I can't think clearly. I don't, this is, I, my, I'm really starting to get worried. I was like, you have been in chronic depletion for quite some
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
And so this is your job. You have to become an expert on rest and you have to help heal your brain
Yeah.
through resting, through nutrition, through sleep, through movement, and through
Mhm.
community. The community piece, all the research is telling us, is probably the most important. I
Huge.
mean, the other things are important, but research is telling us it is huge for being able to feel like we are human, which you
Mhm.
are as a therapist, even though we think we're superhuman. We are definitely human.
There are a lot of societal pressures and expectations placed upon us to be functioning in a way that is actually inhuman and that piece of it. But you're right to be able to change that narrative of actually, I'm not a robot. And that a big piece of that, in addition to all those foundations of just wellness, is that community. And I think, especially to have community with other therapists, is so critically
Yeah.
important
Oh,
because
yeah.
a lot of relationships, even the most loving and well meaning friends, I think it's hard for them to really understand what it is that we go through. And so I think that there's something special about having those professional slash
Yeah.
personal relationships, you know? Yeah.
I'm just laughing because like one of my top posts on LinkedIn was like,
Mhm.
therapy is weird, y'all.
It
This is
really is.
weird. We have these close
Mhm.
relationships with people, yet we're
Yeah.
not in their life. They
No.
tell us their most intimate secrets and their freaking politics, by the way. I could hold off on that one. But,
Mhm.
and we are just like, yeah, I empathetic, even though we're triggered inside and we want to
Mhm.
scream. Sometimes we don't. It's weird.
Yeah, it is weird. And you know what? So I was actually thinking about that in the aftermath of particularly this last election cycle, which it felt different for me this time in terms of people on both sides. Their just hostility towards the other perspective. It felt really intense. But I actually wound up hosting a pop-up like therapist crisis support group, just like calling up like I think it was a day or two after the election. But that was a big topic that came up was around to what it actually feels like to need to be an emotionally safe person dedicated to the well-being of this other human and holding the space and also have a mandate to understand their perspective, have unconditional positive regard for someone who may be saying things that, particularly this like election cycle, it feels like the antithesis of everything that you believe and stand for ethically, morally. It is a weird position to be in. You're absolutely right. But this in itself, it creates this stress and potentially moral injury. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think I think when I was in the previous election cycle as a
Mhm.
therapist, I wasn't this election cycle was great for me, by the way, because I
Mhm.
wasn't a
Yeah, you're like eating your popcorn on the sidelines. You're like, "Gonna-
not
all
I was
right, have
posting
fun,
about it.
kids."
I was
Mhm.
talking to other therapists about what they were feeling, but for me personally, I was
Uh-huh.
great.
Yeah.
I
You're
don't
like,
like what's going on in our country. However, I was
like,
personally okay, but feeling it for my colleagues, yeah. So
yeah.
yeah, that is the moral injury piece that we have to hold the space. Yet we feel that what our clients is saying might be racist.
Mhm.
We are not morally connected at all to what they're saying. We think it's wrong,
Mhm.
100%, and we listen and we hold the space, and we are supposed to say quote unquote neutral. And I think there's lots of that's a whole nother like
Well, yeah, we'll have
mess.
to have a part 2 on that. But there's so much here. But I think another interesting aspect of what it is that you're doing now, and you went through this own reflective period and discovery period, and it sounds like came to terms with the fact that you didn't want to continue in that role and have since shifted into really being a guide and a mentor, helping therapists navigate some of these important decisions, particularly those of whom who have come into this end stage burnout, as you call it, where it feels like their career is either not redeemable, there is no redemption for the career, or that they do not wish to put in the time and energy and work to make it be different, which is also
Yeah.
completely valid. But tell us about that, because I think that's just so interesting.
Like where we get at the end or
Yeah,
like
or
where
like where
Mhm.
your role in this.
Yeah, my role, I mostly work with therapists who are closing a private practice. So I
Mm,
help them shut the thing down
mm,
and then figure out their next steps. So a lot of times when I was closing my practice, I felt really alone and it felt really awful
mm.
because it was a lot of endings, a lot of goodbyes. There was multiple terminations. Again, is a whole other podcast episode, which I talk
Yeah.
often about of how to terminate when it's not a like we're not moving, you're not having a baby, you're not changing jobs, but you're just like, I'm just done and we're gonna end therapy now. So I talk with therapists a lot about that piece of
Mhm,
it. And really I help I half of the work is giving them permission that if they want something else for
mhm.
themselves, that they can get it. They
Yeah.
can do it. They can do what they want. I think for me, my realization was I was different as a mother. I
Mhm,
was different as a partner. I was depressed and angry. And it wasn't my clients that were causing that, but it was the way that I was in the work. And I didn't like who I was becoming or who I
mhm.
had to become to stay in the work personally.
Yeah.
And I know that some therapists can and they manage that well. And I liken it to I saw another burnout podcaster say some of us, when it's cold, we need 10 million layers. So we're not freezing. I need all those layers, or I'm just gonna get and some people can roll it in a t-shirt and they're like,
Mhm,
no, I'm actually good in here. It's fine. I can deal with it. It's not a problem.
mhm.
So I think certainly it's our personal factors that maybe have us struggle more so with the work than others. Like I
Mhm.
just feel everything. I'm like in it with you. And some therapists have more of that natural separation. I think of my husband, who's a psychologist. And when I started my podcast, he was like, is there enough to talk about? Like a whole podcast on therapist burnout? Do you think there's enough therapists that are that burnout? I was like, are you kidding me? Because he just
Funny.
hasn't experienced it.
Yeah,
Because I
yeah.
think just naturally, he just kind of is able to navigate
Mhm,
the world differently than
mhm.
most people.
Yeah. No, but that's there are intrinsic did you ever read that? What is it? The orchid and the dandelion, I think.
Mm.
It's interesting, but that some people are, as you say, probably more empathetic, feel things more deeply, and that others, not that they don't feel or care, but they're less, I don't know, that there's a difference in the way things hit them. And there's so many other variables too. The kind of work you're doing, the
Oh,
personality,
okay.
the
So many
trauma, the
things.
whole, so it's like not, I don't want to pin this on like any one thing, but you bring up good points that different people experience this differently. Okay. And I know I feel like we could just talk about this forever, but for a
Sure.
therapist who is listening to this, who maybe has been privately wondering to themselves, like, I don't know if this is sustainable. And I would actually be interested too to hear some statistics from you, because I do also know that therapists leave the profession. Like, I don't know what the actual numbers are in terms of percentages or anything like that. Perhaps you do, but it's definitely a thing. And so, for somebody who's in that space, do you have any thoughts or perspective that would help them? And I know that there's a lot to work through here. It's probably a process to get that clarity and
Sure.
then figure things out. But can you share a few thoughts, I
Yeah,
guess?
I can
Mhm.
share a few thoughts. I think the mix for a lot of the people that I work with has been starting to ask some of those questions. First of all, I think who, what, and where.
Mhm.
Who am I seeing?
Yeah.
What's the work that I'm doing? Where is my setting? Like, where, look at those variables. Is there anything I can change? And change it if you can and
Mhm.
see if that's something that can work for you. I think for me, of the mix had been a lot in doing my own personal therapy. I've done my own personal coaching to try to work on this.
Mhm.
It's been a long process to get to where I am to figure out this piece. And I still bump against burnout. Still.
Yeah.
My mantra is I can't burn out of my burnout pocket because I'm just prone.
Yeah.
I'm just prone to it. It's
Yeah.
just that's just who I am. I tend to dive deep into things.
Mhm.
So like, let's just go in. I'm ready to go.
Mm.
So I think learning that about yourself, learning your triggers, learning like, when do I start to feel crispy? Oh, it's when I start to fill up my schedule with other things. I don't have my Friday rest day, and recovery started to
Mhm.
get filled with like other things that I was doing. So I had to know our little warning signs about what's
Mhm.
popping up. But I feel like in stage burnout, where I was, looks like all hands on deck. Who's bringing you lasagnas and medical care, mental health
Right.
care? You need it all. You need it
Mhm.
all. And I think trying to do the patchwork can get you so far. And that's where I feel like a lot of therapists get to is they're like, oh, I can keep going just a little bit longer. Like maybe I can figure this out. But they know it's not working. And that's typically if it's not working, you can't do this. I'd like you to think about what is it going to cost you to stay? And I really want you to really write that down. What is it
Mhm.
costing you to stay in the situation you're in right now? Whether
Yeah.
that's your agency job, whether that's your private practice. And for me, that was being a calm mom to my
Mhm.
boys, being a connected partner, being able to have sound mental health.
Yeah.
So those personal consequences that I had and a lot of therapists have. So I think starting with healing.
Mhm.
So being an expert on rest, getting the healing you need is where I'd start for a lot of people. There's statistics about up to half of us leave the field as therapists. So sometimes they're anywhere between 30 to 50%, depending
Oh,
on the study that you look at. So not a lot of us can stay in this career long term. So I always suggest if there's a way that you can do other, maybe not quit therapy entirely. If that's you like, I want to keep it great.
mhm.
But maybe you think about doing some other things, whether it be some kind of side job or some other way that you can generate
Mhm.
income that doesn't drain you the way the therapy does.
Yeah.
So I'd have therapists think of that.
So interesting. I'm reflecting on the statistics. I would love it if you would share that. And you guys, I will be linking to all of the resources that Dr. Jen is sharing in the
Yeah.
article for this post so that you can access everything. Just anecdotally, like I have a good friend and she's running a nonprofit agency and it is a tough crowd. It's like trauma work with kids, but part of what she's doing she's an APA internship site for psychologists to do their
Mhm.
psychology internship. And she shared with me that she has had quite a few actually interns come in, do their internship year, and at the end of it, be like, I'm going to go to law school or something. Like don't even actually become licensed. They finish their
Yeah.
training and are like, yeah, I think I'm good.
And there's a
So
huge percent of us that don't
yeah,
make it to licensure, don't make it to the end of the
yeah,
process.
yeah,
So I don't know those statistics off the top of my head, but
right.
pretty
No,
good chunk of people do.
that's really interesting. Okay, and I love your recommendations for reflection to do some questioning around not just what would you lose if you made a career pivot, but what is the cost of staying? Because I think that is really important to be thinking about. Very lastly, can I just ask you one more thing before we wrap up? That what do you think it is about maybe a better question? Do you think that therapists struggle more than people in other professions who have done the same work? You know what I mean? There's a lot that goes into it. We have graduate degrees, you go through a lot of training, there may be student loan debt involved, and you do all this work and then get to a place and you're like, crap, I hate this. I don't want to keep doing this. That feels bad. But that's probably true if you were a doctor, if you're a lawyer, many professions. Do you feel like therapists have a harder time letting go of this than other professionals might? And if so, what do you think makes it so hard for therapists to feel like they do have permission to do something else?
Yeah. I mean, so many themes there, but I
Hmm.
think a lot of it is we often tie our identity to
Yeah.
the work. So I am a therapist, right?
Hmm.
That's an identity that someone has. So if not, I'm not a therapist. What am I now?
Yeah.
And that's a question you have to reckon with. And I would say you are first a human being. That's
Hmm.
number one before you're anything else. And human beings need a lot of things. They need joy, they need connection, they need like great food and movement and
Hmm.
wonderful experiences in their life to feel happy and healthy. And so if we start there, if you're human, then we figure out, are you still a therapist? Can all those things be true and still be a therapist? I don't know. But I think it's also just figuring out more of who you are again, because I think a lot of times people get so tied into that identity as a therapist in the caring and doing the work that they lose themselves. And I think that's part of it. It's the caring nature. And I think for a lot of people in healthcare, for doctors and people that are in these
Mhm.
roles, it does become part of your identity. And it's learning to figure out, like, who am I without this? Because that always has to be first.
Yeah.
So I think it's a lot of that stuff. I don't know if there was a second part of the question. Sorry.
That's great. I think that really summed it up beautifully is that it's probably true for many people who have a lot of their identity wrapped up in their professional role, but that the real work here is stepping out of that a little bit, which may be harder for therapists to do because I think that there is that like that natural caretaking, other focus, but turning the mirror
Yeah.
back on ourselves and really reflecting on who are we as humans and getting a little bit of distance from this professional title that is
Right.
an important piece of that and just making some space for the fact that we're more than that role. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that we can do other things like
Yeah.
that. You can figure it out. And I've seen people figure it out.
Right. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming and spending this time with me today, Dr. Jen. This was a fantastic conversation. If a therapist listening to this would like to hear more of your perspective or learn more about your
Yeah.
work, where would they find you?
Probably the podcast. So I host the Therapist Burnout podcast. So you can find me in most any podcast players. And I'm
Mhm.
also at drjenblanchette.com with two T's and E. And I'd love to connect with you.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thanks again for doing this with me today. And maybe we'll have a chance to talk again soon.
Yeah, it'd be awesome.
Thank you.